Fort Jackson. Confederate sentries still man the ramparts they guarded during the Civil War. And in one of Savannah's finest mansions, the specter of a wealthy merchant hovers over the home he built more than a century ago. In Savannah's graveyards, the spirits of the dead still walk the earth. Spirits that have returned from the beyond to haunted Savannah. To the casual observer, Savannah, Georgia is the very picture of quaint southern sophistication. But there is more to the city than meets the eye. Founded more than 250 years ago, Savannah has withstood war, famine, plague, hurricanes and fires. With so much turmoil, it's no wonder tales of ghostly encounters abound.
Where you've had a lot of tragedy, people dying unexpectedly, either fevers or the different wars that we have had, and the hurricanes, the floods, then you have more ghosts, and it says something about the fact there really is something there.
Savannah just is full of spirits. There are spirits everywhere. I've seen them at functions. I've seen them in restaurants. It all goes with the history.
The low country of South Carolina and Georgia is filled with people who practice voodoo. And they say on Halloween, you take your black cat and hide and put him in the, lock him in the closet so he doesn't get sacrificed.
Colonial Park is the oldest public cemetery in Savannah. For 100 years, from 1750 until 1850, it served as the final resting place for many of the city's most prominent figures, including several patriots who fell during the American Revolution. On moonless nights, the spirits of these fallen heroes are said to still walk the grounds of the cemetery. In 1777, this was also the site of a famous duel between two of Savannah's most notable citizens, Lachlan McIntosh, a Revolutionary War hero, and Button Gwinnett, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. McIntosh and Gwinnett had become bitter enemies during the Revolution. Gwinnett had charged McIntosh's brother with treason and blamed McIntosh himself for a failed military operation. Their simmering animosity finally came to a head when McIntosh challenged Gwinnett to a duel. They met in a clearing just south of the cemetery on May 16, 1777. Gwinnett was mortally wounded and died a few days later. His death led to calls for the abolition of dueling, but the practice would continue well into the next century. Ironically, the two men, bitter rivals in life, would be neighbors in death. Both McIntosh and Gwinnett were buried in Colonial Park Cemetery. And when conditions are just right, a visitor to the park may see the ghostly forms of two men in 18th century garb facing each other across the field of honor. Less than a mile away, the Pirate's House is one of the oldest and most haunted buildings in Savannah. Today, it is a world-famous restaurant with over a dozen dining rooms. But it was once an inn for seafarers, smugglers, and criminals.
According to the legends that have been handed down from generation to generation, it was originally built in 1754. And it was built as a seaman's inn, and it became a hangout for sailors and pirates from all over the world.
Some believe that the spirits of these rough men still linger at the inn. It was supposedly here in the pirate's house that the real-life Captain Flint, portrayed in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, gave the map of the island to Billy Bones while on his deathbed.
Tradition has it that some of the early action of the story took place here based around the death of old Captain Flint in one of the upstairs bedrooms. And every book of Treasure Island has a map in the front of Treasure Island, and the map is dated Savannah, Georgia, which proves some connection with the Pirate House and Treasure Island.
Many people believe that Stevenson based the character of Captain Flint on a real person, and that his ghost still wanders the pirate's house.
I was in my office, and the night manager, who had been closing the restaurant for the night, knocked on my door and came in, and he was visibly excited and visibly quite shook up about what he had just experienced. And I asked him what was the matter, and he said, well, I was just closing up one of the dining rooms, and as I was walking by the door to the room, he said, all of a sudden I thought I saw, he said, I could swear I saw a man sitting in a chair at the table. And he said that it was so vivid in my mind that I stopped and turned around and went back to the room and looked, and there was no one there. He was genuinely scared. I knew he was scared because he was white. He was shaking.
Another legend concerns a secret tunnel that ran from the rum cellar of the inn to the river less than a block away. Many a careless sailor was said to have met a dismal fate in these dark passageways.
According to the stories, they used to get men drunk in the bar upstairs, and they would take them drunk and unconscious. They'd carry them through the tunnel and take them aboard ships, and that's how they got a lot of their crews together. When you go down into the old rum cellar, there's evidence of maybe several doorways that have long since been bricked up, blocked, so that there's no way to get into the tunnel. But there's evidence of a tunnel that did run from the old rum cellar to the river.
But there's a story dating back a few decades about one intrepid soul who decided to explore the old tunnel before it was bricked up. As he slowly picked his way through the dark passageway, his foot struck an object embedded in the dirt. Gathering up his courage, he pressed on. Finally, he came to a dead end. Sometime during the past, the tunnel had caved in. Suddenly, he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He pressed himself against the wall as a group of shadowy figures went by with a blast of icy air. He watched breathlessly as they passed through the solid wall as if it didn't exist. The terrified man beat a hasty retreat and vowed never to go back into the tunnel. Is it possible that the spirits of these seafarers of old still wander through the pirate's house? Former owner Herb Traub is skeptical, but admits that if any place should be haunted, it would be here.
If there are going to be ghosts, why they wouldn't want to take up residence in the pirate's house, because it's an old building. It'd be a perfect place for ghosts to hide out. Yeah, it really would be. If they come, I hope they eat here.
The Pirate's House is not the only restaurant in Savannah with a resident ghost. Coming up, they say that the spirit of a Revolutionary War hero inhabits the former mansion known to all in Savannah as the Old Pink House. The Old Pink House on Reynolds Square is the only surviving 18th century mansion in Savannah. Today it is one of Savannah's finest restaurants, but in 1776 it was a private home and a breeding ground for insurrection. The mansion is said to have been built in 1771 by James Habersham, a wealthy merchant, planter, and staunch loyalist. His sons, however, supported the growing independence movement. By 1775, the colonists were demanding greater freedom from British rule, leading to violent clashes in the street. Joseph, John, and James Habersham Jr. were all members of the Liberty Boys, a local group of pro-independence revolutionaries. Here in the old Pink House, they met in secret and plotted against the colonial government. During one meeting in January of 1776, they agreed to arrest the royal governor. A few weeks later, Joseph Habersham walked into the governor's mansion and put Governor James Wright under arrest. Wright was held by the colonials for a month until he escaped to a waiting British ship. Following the revolution, James Habersham Jr. inherited the residence. Habersham eventually sold the house, and over the years it served as a bank, office building, and bookstore. It was finally restored and turned into a world-class restaurant in the 1980s. Some people believe, however, that the ghost of James Habersham Jr. still watches over the old Pink House.
The Pink House restaurant is a very quaint place. One of the most charming eating places in all of Savannah. And of course, it is reported to have the spirit of James Habersham Jr. Wandering about, making sure that everything is fine, because he was very proud of this house.
James Habersham Jr. makes his presence known in many ways. The furniture in the dining room is mysteriously rearranged during the night. Candles are lit without human aid. Passers-by and guests have seen a man dressed in colonial attire who bears a strong resemblance to the oil portrait hanging in the front hall. At first, they think he is an employee, until he vanishes into thin air. Habersham is apparently a restless spirit. According to one local legend, his ghost also haunts the family plot in nearby Colonial Park Cemetery. The story goes that during the late 1800s, an Irish seamstress became entranced with a mysterious young man she had seen passing in the street. Intrigued, she decided to follow him one night. She trailed behind him as he walked into Colonial Cemetery and approached the Habersham family plot. While she watched, the man vanished into the night mist. She never saw the man again, but many Savannians believe that this was the spirit of James Habersham Jr., the revolutionary hero. Of course, Colonial Park is not the only graveyard with restless spirits. Bonaventure Cemetery on the outskirts of Savannah is regarded as one of the most beautiful burial grounds in America. Every year, thousands of visitors come to Bonaventure to wander among the Spanish moss-laden oak trees and marvel at the magnificent monuments. Among those buried here are governors, statesmen, war heroes, and celebrities.
Bonaventure is such a wonderful, haunting, beautiful place. Many Savannians believe to be buried in Bonaventure is almost as good as being alive anywhere else.
200 years ago, however, Bonaventure was one of the most magnificent plantations in the Savannah area. Many local residents believe that the spirits of the wealthy planters still walk these grounds. Bonaventure was originally owned by Colonel Josiah Tatnall, a Revolutionary War hero and former governor of Georgia. The Tatnall home at Bonaventure was renowned as Savannah's most impressive plantation house, until it was destroyed one fateful day in 1800 and became the basis of Savannah's oldest ghost story.
Christmas time 1800, Colonel was giving a wonderful party in the dining room, and lo and behold, the house catches fire. The Colonel simply orders the table out onto the lawn, and the people come out and presumably finish their meal.
The guest and Governor Tatnall began exchanging toast. And one of them said, "May the joy of this occasion never end."
And supposedly the meal was finished by Josiah Tatnall throwing his crystal goblet onto the oak tree and all the guests following suit.
Bonaventure was never rebuilt after the fire. Eventually, the gardens and terraces of the plantation became a cemetery. But the convivial spirit of Josiah Tatnall apparently still entertains his guests. On certain nights, you just may hear something.
If you go out to Bonaventure in the fall when the wind is just right and the trees, full moon over the water, you will still hear the crash of wine glasses and laughter. People going by boat at night have said that they have seen people in, quote, old-fashioned clothing walking around out at Bonaventure.
The spirits of Josiah Tatnall and his guests may still revel in their good fortune, but there are other ghosts from that same time that are trapped in misery, not celebration. During the early 1800s, Savannah was a prosperous, bustling port city which served the great rice and cotton plantations in the surrounding area. This newfound affluence was reflected in the magnificent mansions built by the wealthy planters and traders.
The antebellum period, the first part of the 19th century, was the golden period of Savannah history. This was when there was money, this was when there was elegance, this was when there was refinement.
This prosperity, however, came with a price: the forced labor of slaves. Slavery had been legalized in the colony in 1750, and thousands of slaves from the West Indies and Africa were brought into the area to work on the nearby plantations and city docks. These slaves were kept chained at night in the cotton warehouses that lined the riverfront. Some believe that the spirits of these wretched souls still haunt the waterfront.
There are stories of the warehouses on River Street facing the Savannah River where cotton was kept, but also perhaps slaves were shackled and kept until they were sold. And so if you hear chains rattling, moans and groans, perhaps they are the spirit. And so if you hear chains rattling, moans and groans, perhaps they are the spirits of slaves bemoaning their fate.
Perhaps these slaves found their ultimate revenge. Slavery, the very institution upon which the city was so dependent, had created a festering wound that would tear the nation apart. For in 1861, Savannah, along with the rest of the country, would be plunged into war. A war which for some continues to this very day. When we return, the ghostly sentry who guards Savannah's Fort Jackson. On April 16, 1861, secessionist forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Georgia joined the other southern states and seceded from the Union. The Civil War had begun. In retaliation, Union forces began a blockade of Savannah. The Confederates took up the defense of the city at Fort Jackson, a fortification dating back to the Revolutionary War. The rebels evacuated the fort upon the arrival of General Sherman's army in late 1864. According to witnesses, however, some of these soldiers are still fighting for their lost cause. Visitors and guides at Fort Jackson report sightings of ghostly apparitions in Confederate gray, the specters of the men who defended Savannah from attack.
Usually it involves an eerie feeling, maybe a shadow, a form that they see in the darkness. Sometimes the form is wearing a Civil War cap and a jacket, and often at first glance these people will think maybe this is one of my employees or one of my co-workers, and then they'll realize that they're the last person at the site and that was not one of their co-workers.
One such encounter occurred a few years ago. James McAdams, a local author, recalls an experience the former site manager had while closing up one evening.
He said he saw a figure, a shadowy figure, he described it, walking across the parade ground towards the center. He thought it was me, so he called out, "Jim, is that you?" There was no reply. The figure reached a point about in the middle of the parade ground and then suddenly vanished. So I worked with him for quite a while. He is the type of person that does not scare too easily.
Adams also recalls another incident that took place a few years ago.
Two of the employees of the fort were cleaning the fort after it had closed for the day, and a young lady who was working for her first day here at the fort thought she heard something. She turned to the door that was open, and she said she saw a figure standing in the door, a figure dressed in Confederate uniform. As she said, the figure stood there for just a few seconds. Then he turned and walked out. Well, this affected this young lady so much that the next day she called in her resignation and she never came back.
One of the spirits that haunt the fort may be that of Private Garrity, a Confederate soldier involved in a bizarre incident during the Civil War.
Well, the story goes that there were three officers sitting outside the fort late one evening, probably about where we are now, in this location near the flagpole. And one lieutenant got up, Lieutenant Dickerson, and he proceeded to walk inside the fort, across the drawbridge, and came up to a sentry there, Private Garrity. As the officer passed him, Garrity took aim with his musket and fired at Lieutenant Dickerson. The rifle misfired, so he turned the musket over and clubbed Lieutenant Dickerson over the head with it, knocked him to the ground, and then he struck him an additional 3 times. It inflicted 4 serious wounds on Lieutenant Dickerson, breaking his skull in 4 places. Private Garrity then, noticing what he'd done, seeing other men run into Lieutenant's aid, ran and jumped into the moat. Before anyone could save him, he drowned.
No one knows why Garrity attacked the officer. His secret died with him in his watery grave. But over the years, visitors have encountered a Confederate sentry as they cross the moat. Perhaps it is Garrity, condemned to guard the fort for eternity to atone for his attack on the officer. The spirits of the Confederate soldiers may still walk the grounds of Fort Jackson, but there is another location in Savannah where the spirits of Union soldiers still linger. By late 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman was cutting a path of devastation through Georgia on his march to the sea. After having watched Sherman's troops burn Atlanta to the ground, the people of Savannah were determined to save their beautiful city.
Savannahans are a very practical people. When Sherman's troops were on the outskirts of Savannah, the mayor and members of the city council rode out under flag of truce and surrendered the city. And so Savannah was not burned during the Civil War.
Sherman allowed a force of 10,000 battered Confederates to flee and took control of the city on December 22, 1864. During the federal occupation of Savannah, a makeshift Union hospital was set up in the Marshall House, Savannah's oldest hotel. A military hospital during the Civil War was as close to hell as one could imagine. Disease was rampant, and the anguished screams of suffering men filled the air as surgeons operated with little or no anesthesia. Sometimes the doctors would have to pile the amputated limbs into an open pit. Following the Civil War, the Marshall House reverted to a hotel. In the 1990s, the hotel was renovated. During construction, workmen made a gruesome discovery in the basement.
You can imagine during the Civil War period, there were a lot of people here, I'm sure, that were injured. and there was probably a lot of deaths. So they didn't have anywhere to put them. And a lot of times they would put them in the street or in the basement. And they did find some bones here, quite a few actually. It was spooky, you can imagine, finding bones as you're under construction. And there have been some events or sightings, whatever, reported by guests and employees.
Since the hotel reopened, there have been several reports of a ghostly apparition in a blue uniform. Is it possible that the spirit of a Union soldier who died here still walks these corridors? In the summer of 1999, the Searchers, a group of paranormal investigators, came to the Marshall House to determine if the hotel was, in fact, haunted.
The hotel staff invited us here for prior to the opening of the hotel, and to investigate the hotel to see what we could pick up and identify. Some of our members got the impression that there was a Union soldier in the basement wandering the halls. The basement is very small. It's a very short hallway, and the impressions were that there was a soldier specifically down in one particular area of the hotel.
There are apparently other spirits haunting the Marshall House as well. Employees have heard unexplained noises in the hotel. Guests have also had strange encounters with a mischievous child.
We had a guest that stayed here, and came down as he checked out and reported that he'd woke up in the middle of the night and looked at the foot of his bed, and there was a little girl there tickling his feet. It was more or less a transparent type figure, so it was obvious that it wasn't a real little girl that had gotten into his room in the middle of the night. And so it was quite a shock to wake up to something like that.
If there are ghosts wandering the halls of the Marshall House, what draws them to the grand old hotel?
If a person has a very tragic death, a lot of times they don't go on to where they're supposed to go. And this is what our group believes, that they wind up becoming stuck in a place where they're not supposed to be. They don't understand that they're supposed to move on.
Perhaps the apparitions at the Marshall House are spirits stranded in a no-man's land between the living and the dead. But Savannah's favorite ghost story concerns a faithful husband who came back from the dead to escort his wife to the afterlife. Not all ghost stories involve murder or violence. One of Savannah's most famous ghost stories is a tale of eternal love associated with the Juliet Gordon Low house. This Regency mansion was built in 1818 and was the birthplace of Juliet Gordon Low, the founder of the Girl Scouts of the USA. It is also said to be haunted by the spirits of Juliet's parents, Nellie and William Washington Gordon II. The Gordon family has been one of the most prominent families in Savannah for nearly 200 years. William served with distinction in both the Confederate and United States armies.
He was a very much loved and admired man who never tried to take the limelight for himself. His wife and his daughter did most of that.
William married Nellie Kinsey in 1858. By all accounts, Willie and Nellie were very much in love.
They were very devoted, and Nellie made it perfectly clear that she preferred him to anybody else, including her own children. He was the center of her life.
Well, I think that Nellie and Willie were very much in love. They had a wonderful life here in this house over 50 years, raised a large family.
After Willie Gordon died in 1912, Nellie was heartbroken. In her remaining years, she talked constantly of the day when she would join her dear husband.
Nellie said, "Now don't grieve for me. I will be so happy to be with Willie that I think you should all have a great party for me."
5 years later, on February 22nd, 1917, Nellie lay close to death. That day, General Gordon returned for his beloved Nellie.
My grandmother was very old and had been ill and was dying in the front room up there, the second floor of this house. And my father and his brothers and sisters were gathered around her bed. My mother, who was not a member of the immediate family, was waiting in the room on the north side of the house, adjoining this other room. And while she waited, it seemed to her that my grandfather, who'd been dead for 5 or 6 years, came through the door and passed through the room where she was sitting, said nothing to her. He was wearing a business suit, he was not in uniform. Mother was startled, certainly, and amazed to see somebody who'd been dead for several years. But when Father came out a minute later and said that his mother had died, they might as well go home, she didn't mention this to him. She thought it would just upset him.
A moment later, however, Morrison, the elderly family butler, was shocked to see General Gordon come walking down the front stairs.
And Morrison said that all he knew was that the general had come down the stairs, passed by him without speaking, and gone out the front door. Morrison thought that perhaps he'd come to bring his bride or his wife back with him. We couldn't understand it or explain it, but it had a veracity to it that a lot of these tales don't have.
This is a perfect ghost story because you have two people relating a story that they had no chance to get together on their details. They immediately, spontaneously told the same story of seeing General Gordon walk out of Nellie's bedroom. And this was a ghost with a reason to come back, and it's just a wonderful love story.
Since that day in 1917, there have been reports of phantom footsteps on the stairs. Perhaps the ghost of General Gordon continues to visit the home he once shared with his beloved wife. We will never know for sure, but in the years since Nellie's passing, this tale of a love that transcended death has become Savannah's most enduring ghost story. Another imposing home in Savannah is the Hamilton Turner Inn. This ornate 4-story mansion is known to locals as the Charles Adams House, due to its sinister Gothic appearance. When it was built in 1873, it was the largest house in town. It was the first home in the city to have electricity and became one of the centers of Savannah society. Today, the mansion is an elegant bed and breakfast with 15 guest suites. But the ghost of Samuel Pugh Hamilton, the man who built the house, apparently still keeps watch over his domain.
I had a girlfriend who was renting one of the apartments, and she says, "You know, Mr. Hamilton comes and goes all the time." I said, "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it." She said, "Yeah, you need to hear it." And she related to me the story exactly how she saw him one night when they came in from dinner and they looked up at the top of the steps and screamed because there he was. And by the time they screamed, he disappeared in a milky cast. It just kind of went away.
Nancy Hillis has never actually seen the apparition of Samuel Pugh Hamilton, but she believes that she and a fellow tenant heard him one evening.
She and I one night were the only people in the mansion. I heard hard running, just fast, hard, heavy running, someone with a lot of weight running up the steps, the main steps. I waited a few minutes and then I came out to the foyer, which I lived on this parlor floor, and she was on the top floor, and I looked up the steps and you can see, and she's looking down. She said, "Did you hear that?" I said, "Did you hear that?" She said, "Yes, I've called the police." I said, "Oh, good." So the police came. They went all through the house, found nothing. The only way in and out are the front door and the top door out of the 4th floor, which was locked from the inside, and the front door was locked from the inside. So that was very unexplainable.
There are also other spirits inhabiting the house, those of the Hamilton children who lived on the top floor of the mansion. They keep guests awake at night rolling pool balls across the bedroom floor.
To my knowledge, no one's ever seen the children, but tons of people have heard them. When you hear the children, they're all together. There's a female giggle and several little other giggles. Little high giggles and not evil giggles. And the way a pool balls sound after you've put them in the little triangle thing and you've broken them, that sound, it's a strange sound that nothing makes but pool balls breaking. And then rolling of pool balls, rolling. I know they're here. I know the spirits of the children are still here. And they're not angry. They giggle and they laugh and they roll pool balls.
The spirits at the Hamilton Turner house appear to be benign. But another grand old Savannah home seems to have been possessed by a malicious spirit, and the man who owned it would come face to face with the world of the unknown. During the first half of the 20th century, there was little effort made to the unknown. During the first half of the 20th century, there was little effort made to preserve or restore Savannah's historic legacy. Many elegant old homes were lost to neglect and development. But in the 1960s, several civic groups began to fight to preserve and restore Savannah's architectural heritage. One of the first grand old mansions to be saved was the Hampton Lilliebridge House. Originally built in 1796 for a wealthy plantation owner, it was moved from its original location in 1963 and restored by a man named Jim Williams. Williams would later achieve notoriety as the defendant in an infamous murder trial, the principal character of the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. At the time, however, he was a respected antiques dealer and decorator with a passion for restoring old homes.
Once Jim moved the house to its present location and began restoring it, his workmen experienced strange apparitions. Reportedly, the workmen saw and heard people in the upper floors, when in fact there were no people on the upper floors.
For months, the workmen continued to complain of mysterious footsteps, cold spots, and unearthly screams and moans. Williams was so disturbed by these reports that he had an exorcism performed by an Episcopal bishop on December 7th, 1963.
You know, someone has defined a ghost as a being seen by others. And I don't think Jim Williams ever claimed that he actually ever saw a ghost. But he was convinced that other people had seen ghosts. That is why he brought in that Episcopal bishop to perform this exorcism.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
He really just didn't want to talk about it. He said, "My dear, there is a lot of evil in this world." And then he went on to talk about something else. He did not want to discuss it. The house evidently had a very evil spirit in it, and he believed it deeply.
The exorcism seemed to have little effect. The workmen continued to report strange sounds and unexplained footsteps in the house. After he moved into the house in 1964, Williams himself experienced mysterious occurrences. Finally, a year later, he sold the house, leaving the spirits to the new owners. In 1969, Williams bought this Italianate mansion on Monterey Square, built in 1861 by Confederate Brigadier General Hugh W. Mercer. General Mercer was the great-grandfather of one of Savannah's most cherished favorite sons, lyricist and composer Johnny Mercer. By the time Williams purchased the home, the Mercer house had fallen into disrepair. He immediately set about restoring the mansion to its former splendor. Mercer House soon became one of the focal points for Savannah society. The annual Christmas party that Jim Williams hosted was the highlight of the winter social season. But on May 2nd, 1981, Mercer House became a murder scene. According to Jim Williams, Danny Hansford, a 21-year-old handyman who did part-time work for him, had confronted him during a drunken rage in the study. Hansford pulled a gun, but when the gun misfired, Williams pulled his own gun from the desk drawer and fired back in self-defense. The Savannah District Attorney, however, argued that Williams had shot Hansford without provocation. He charged Williams with murder in the first degree. Williams was twice convicted of murder, but both convictions were overturned on appeal. A third trial resulted in a mistrial. Williams found himself on trial for murder for the fourth time. During his court battles, Williams was not content to put his entire faith in the judicial system. As depicted in the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, he enlisted the services of a local root doctor named Minerva.
You know, the South has a reputation of being Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, but there's a strong undercurrent of African-American culture in the South, even today. Rich, educated white people, when confronted with a dreadful situation, often called on the services of these voodoo priestesses and root doctors to aid them in their troubles.
I want to say it's not voodoo because it's not voodoo. I consider it to be spiritual work. To me, voodoo has a negative connotation to it because of what society has deemed it to be. I believe that voodoo itself, which is actually pronounced voodoo, can be used to help people because it's a religion that's in a race of people, and they use it to help people. They don't necessarily use it to hurt people.
There are voodoo priestesses all over Savannah, and Jim knew a few, and one in particular he liked, Minerva. And we went to see Minerva one night before his third trial because Jim wanted her to place a curse on the district attorney.
According to John Barrett, he accompanied Jim Williams and Minerva on a midnight trip to a cemetery to work her root magic.
She said, we're going to go at dead time. You know about dead time, don't you? Dead time lasts 1 hour. From half hour before midnight to half an hour after midnight. The first half hour is for doing good. The second half hour is for doing evil. She also explained that at midnight, you can scoop up graveyard dirt from a grave, and you can throw it on someone's porch, and it would cast a horrible spell and a curse on them.
Minerva performed a series of strange rituals, calling on the spirits of the dead to aid Jim Williams in his legal struggles.
The rituals are just things that need to be done, I guess maybe to help people to see that something isn't actually being done to help them, but you don't really need the rituals. All you need is the energy, and the energy comes from within.
We will never know what, if any, effect Minerva's ministrations had on the outcome of the trial. But on May 12, 1989, at the conclusion of his fourth trial, Jim Williams was finally found not guilty. Williams returned to Mercer House and immediately re-entered the Savannah social scene. But less than a year later, Jim Williams suddenly died of pneumonia at the age of 59. Some people wondered if Danny Hansford had somehow taken revenge.
He died almost in the spot where he would have fallen if Danny Hansford had shot him and killed him, in the study behind the desk. And Minerva takes that as a sign that beyond the grave, Danny Hansford got back at him.
Is it possible for the dead to wreak vengeance from beyond the grave? Do restless spirits still wander through Savannah's old mansions? Are the souls of the departed still trapped between the past and the present?
As Mark Twain said, ghosts, said, I do not believe in ghosts, but I'm afraid of them.
Savannah is one of the most historic and beautiful cities in America, if not the world. And if ghosts do exist, why wouldn't they want to come live here?
What What makes someone notorious? Inconceivable crimes.
The hair on the back of your neck stands up when you realize what you're watching.
And a passion for publicity.
He enjoyed the attention. He wanted to be on the front page.
Secret schemes and shocking extremes. 5 nights.
Front of Treasure Island, and the map is dated Savannah, Georgia, which proves some connection with the Pirate House and Treasure Island.
Many people believe that Stevenson based the character of Captain Flint on a real person, and that his ghost still wanders the pirate's house.
I was in my office, and the night manager, who had been closing the restaurant for the night, knocked on my door and came in, and he was visibly excited and visibly quite shook up about what he had just experienced. And I asked him what was the matter, and he said, well, I was just closing up one of the dining rooms, and as I was walking by the door to the room, he said, all of a sudden, I thought I saw, he said, I could swear I saw a man sitting in a chair at the table. And he said that it was so vivid in my mind that I stopped and turned around and went back to the room and looked, and there was no one there. He was genuinely scared. I knew he was scared because he was white. He was shaking.
Another legend concerns a secret tunnel that ran from the rum cellar of the inn to the river less than a block away. Many a careless sailor was sent to a field of honor. Less than a mile away, the Pirate's House is one of the oldest and most haunted buildings in Savannah. Today, it is a world-famous restaurant with over a dozen dining rooms. But it was once an inn for seafarers, smugglers, and criminals.
According to legends that have been handed down from generation to generation, it was originally built in 1754. And it was built as a seaman's inn, and it became a hangout for sailors and pirates from all over the world.
Some believe that the spirits of these rough men still linger at the inn. It was supposedly here in the Pirate's House that the real-life Captain Flint, portrayed in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, gave the map of the island to Billy Bones while on his deathbed.
Tradition has it that some of the early action of the story took place here based around the death of old Captain Flint in one of the upstairs bedrooms, and every book of Treasure Island has a map in the...
Where you've had a lot of tragedy, people dying unexpectedly, either fevers or the different wars that we have had, and the hurricanes, the floods, then you have more ghosts, and it says something about the fact there really is something there.
Savannah just is full of spirits. There are spirits everywhere. I've seen them at functions. I've seen them in restaurants. It all goes with the history.
The low country of South Carolina and Georgia is filled with people who practice voodoo. And they say on Halloween, you take your black cat and hide and put him in the, lock him in the closet so he doesn't get sacrificed.
Colonial Park is the oldest public cemetery in Savannah. For 100 years, from 1750 until 1850, it served as the final resting place for many of the city's most prominent figures, including several patriots who fell during the American Revolution. On moonless nights, the spirits of these fallen heroes are said to still walk the grounds of Fort Jackson. Confederate sentries still man the ramparts they guarded during the Civil War. And in one of Savannah's finest mansions, the specter of a wealthy merchant hovers over the home he built more than a century ago. In Savannah's graveyards, the spirits of the dead still walk the earth. Spirits that have returned from the beyond to haunted Savannah. To the casual observer, Savannah, Georgia is the very picture of quaint southern sophistication. But there is more to the city than meets the eye. Founded more than 250 years ago, Savannah has withstood war, famine, plague, hurricanes, and fires. With so much turmoil, it's no wonder tales of ghostly encounters abound. Cemetery. In 1777, this was also the site of a famous duel between two of Savannah's most notable citizens, Lachlan McIntosh, a Revolutionary War hero, and Button Gwinnett, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. McIntosh and Gwinnett had become bitter enemies during the Revolution. Gwinnett had charged McIntosh's brother with treason and blamed McIntosh himself for a failed military operation. Their simmering animosity finally came to a head when McIntosh challenged Gwinnett to a duel. They met in a clearing just south of the cemetery on May 16, 1777. Gwinnett was mortally wounded and died a few days later. His death led to calls for the abolition of dueling, but the practice would continue well into the next century. Ironically, the two men, bitter rivals in life, would be neighbors in death. Both McIntosh and Gwinnett were buried in Colonial Park Cemetery. And when conditions are just right, a visitor to the park may see the ghostly forms of two men in 18th century garb facing each other across the